We started this conversation about black conservatism with the founding principles. And one of my contentions, for those of you who have been here for many weeks, I'm repeating myself for these new faces, this will be the first time to hear it. One of my contentions has been that black conservatism is unique to traditional conservatism in that because of our history in this country and because of the history of race in this country, we necessarily look to the principles of the Declaration first. I'll leave it at that, and then I would like to get your two impression of your definition of black conservatism. Do you have one? Does it differ from traditional conservatism, and if so, how? We'll start.
Well, I'll start it off. I think conservatism is conservatism. And then there are blacks who are conservative, and quite naturally, we each bring our own set of experiences, aspirations to the basic framework of conservatism. I have framed my approach to government coming out of a sort of natural set of experiences. I'm fond of saying that my dad was so conservative that he prohibited premarital sex because he thought it might lead to slow dancing. And my mom was of the school of thought that you spank your kids once a day, you might not know why, but they surely would. So when you think about that, the experience has been one that is consistent with what Lincoln said, that it's an appreciation that we are not a perfect nation, but that through the actions of men and women who love freedom, we can make the nation better. So he always talked about us not being perfect, but perfectible through human action, and that human action changes the course of history. The framework of the Declaration, of the Constitution is the Declaration of Independence. And for now decades, I've been saying that that second paragraph is so important in that what it talks about in terms of truths that we live by is a fundamental relationship between the individual and the state, and it's found in that's in that part of the sentence that says that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, which basically means that our human rights are part of our human nature. They are gifts from our Creator. They're not grants from government. And that is, in fact, what begins to make us different from statists, what makes us different from those who believe in other totalitarian and authoritarian systems. That the primacy of the individual in our framework of thought as conservatives is that the power and reach of government must be limited in order to have optimum individual liberty. And so I don't think that African Americans are any different than, or whites are any different than blacks any different than whites in that view.
Ken, let me ask this question, and I'll go to Robert and then back to you for your response. The modern conservative movement, and I'm starting in the early 50s, Buckley, et cetera, was missing in action during the civil rights movement, primarily not due to racism, but due to the belief, the ideological stand that government should be limited, that power should be vested in the states, etc. Would black conservatives have sided with Buckley, or would they have been marching on the Pettus Bridge with John Lewis, etc.?
First of all, good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be here. I'm going to answer both of your questions. The first one last. To go back to black conservatism, I agree with 99.9% of what Ken said a few moments ago. The caveat being that I believe that black conservatism is slightly a bit different from regular conservatism. And the reason why I say that is because I believe that black conservatives are like women conservatives, or like Jewish conservatives, or like gay conservatives. There's a bit of a sensitivity issue there that I believe that quote unquote mainstream conservatives, not necessarily they don't have, but it's just a little bit more in tune when in fact you've been oppressed. So when you take a look at African Americans, when you take a look at women, when you take a look at Jewish Americans, or whatever minority that has been historically oppressed, and when you take a look at their conservatism, there's something there that's very similar, and that is a heightened sensitivity to those who are less fortunate. And thus, in the process, their policies, in terms of how they look at those policies, are a bit different. So that's my slight difference with Mr. Blackwell. To answer the second part of your question, I mean, let's just be honest about this. And the unfortunate truth is that I'm a conservative through and through. That's not the unfortunate truth. The unfortunate truth really is that when a lot of folks that look like me were being hosed down, were being denied their right to vote, and were being literally put through litmus tests when it comes to poll taxing and so forth, the modern conservative movement at that time was AWOL. And the reason why they were AWOL is because of two reasons. First and foremost is because they were under the cloak of states' rights. They firmly believed at that time that the states had the ability, the constitutional ability, to be able to govern themselves. In practice, they were absolutely correct. But in reality, in theory, they were absolutely correct. But in reality, nothing could be further from the truth, is because the very states' rights that we all cling to at that time was the very same rights that was oppressing folks that looked like me. So, Buckley, Reagan, to a certain degree, Goldwater, to a certain degree, was to a certain degree missing in action. So the folks out there that were black conservatives at the time, my great-grandfather, his father, his brothers and sisters, were definitely marching with Dr. King, not because it was in vogue, but because it was life or death for them during that time.
Let me give you another perspective. Segregationists weren't with us, but I'm not so quick to say that conservative Republicans were missing in action, because the fact of the matter is that many of the segregationists, many of the Dixiecrats were Democrats. And as we all know, is that if it had not been for a band of moderate to conservative Republicans, the 64 Public Housing Accommodation Act wouldn't have passed, because the white segregationists who were Democrats, Dixiecrats, were a major bloc. So part of the mythology of folks, Republicans and all conservatives being missing in action is part of a myth that has been spun by post-civil rights historians and political activists. Let me give you a story that was shared with me by Morris Abram. Morris Abram was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations in Geneva when I was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations in charge of the human rights portfolio. Morris Abram had been the president of Brandeis University, but most notably, Morris Abram had been one of John F. Kennedy's advisors in 1960. He was Jewish, he was a Democrat, and he was a Southerner through and through. Morris told the story, and I've now had it cross-verified, that if you remember when Dr. King was put in jail in Alabama, in Birmingham, the advisors to both Kennedy and Nixon highly recommended that they call Coretta Scott King, not to take a position on the specific alleged crime of Dr. King, but to say that they would make sure that there was a presence to protect him so that he got due process of law. Nixon rejected the advice. Kennedy rejected the advice initially. It was only when a group of advisors went to Bobby Kennedy and asked Bobby Kennedy to just pound the desk and make his brother make a call that Kennedy made a 2-minute, 30-second call to Coretta Scott King. Now, the reason I say that to you is because they had just started to do polling at that time in that race. And in June and July, in the summer of 1960, the African-American vote was split just about 50-50 Kennedy-Nixon. Between the summer and election day, the shift went 60-40 for Kennedy. Now, I would just suggest that if you go back and you look at how conservatives, and again, moderate conservative Republicans played out in the major civil rights legislation of the time, in direct contradiction and opposition to the Dixiecrats and Segregationists who were Democrats and white Southerners, we have a period where we can point to where conservatives and Republicans did the right thing and were on the right sides of the Human Rights Initiative. It was only until we got to 1968 when now Nixon's people came up with the Southern Strategy, which suggested that we, in fact, should sort of galvanize the anger and disenfranchisement, political, not voting-wise, of white Southerners, and that the Republican tyranny strategy that I thought, that I still think was short-sighted and not the right thing to do in the long term. But in the course of today's discussion, we can get into the collaboration of the NAACP with the Nixon folks who were advancing the Southern strategy for redistricting and purposes and creation of black congressional districts.
This is interesting to me, and so I'd like to touch on this a bit. I don't want to spend too much time, because again, we have a lot of ground to cover, and I want to encourage you once again, don't wait for the question and answer period. If you want to get in and you have questions, raise your hand and I'll come to you. But this idea of the Southern strategy is curious to me, because I don't wonder at the fact of it, but I wonder at its success, because in that election, George Wallace, who was a Democrat, carried the South. In the next election, Nixon won by a landslide and took all of the North as well. The following election, Ford lost. Jimmy Carter won, who was a Democrat again, and carried the South. The next election, Ronald Reagan won by a near landslide, so he took not only the South but the North. And of course, the election after that, he won every state save Minnesota. In other words, where I'm going is that we talk about this Southern strategy, and yet we don't see the South, at least in the national elections, going for the Republican candidate, but going for the Democratic candidate. And then in the elections where the South goes for the Republican, the entire country has voted for the Republican.